What's up everyone, this is Tyler from Mostly Ramps. Today we're going to be talking about building a bowl. This is something that we get requests for all the time, is how do you do the cuts, how do you cut the 2x4 or 2x6 supports, how do you cut the plywood and the pie shape, all that stuff. So bowls are, as anyone knows, are very difficult to build. They require a lot of carpentry skill. So if you're not comfortable with using, a hammer, drills, especially saws, then you may not want to attempt this. But our hope today is that we'll be able to guide you through some basic steps of how to turn your mini ramp into a bowl and that type of thing. What we have behind me is a 3-foot tall mini ramp that we're going to be bowling out. It's not going to be this small when we build this for the customer at his house down in San Diego. The whole ramp is actually going to end up being about 36 feet wide. Right now it's only half of that. So but for our purposes of doing the video and also making this ramp here at our facility in Orange County, California, we like to push everything up together so it's nice and tight. So it's just a smaller workspace for us. But for you guys at home that are making your own bowls, clearly you don't need to butt them up this close like this. So let's jump into it and see how we can build a bowl. This is the space that we're working with. Again, out in the field, it's going to be much bigger than this. You could see that these two corners, we haven't done any framing. The framing on that guy's done. This one's about halfway, and we're cruising along. So the first thing to do to set up is you got to set up your radius, or radii, I guess, plural. But your radius pieces need to be set up, and generally for a bowl we'll use about 5. So 2 on the outer and then 3 radius pieces in the middle. And clearly you want to space them out as evenly as possible, and so that when you cut these supports right here, that the hope is that all of them are identical. And this honestly requires just trial and error. So it's a matter of kind of we use these little spacers here on the ground. Let me point to that. Yeah, to keep them stood up. And so when we're actually first setting up the radius pieces, we'll kind of move them around. So there's no science to it just yet. Just remember, cut the radius pieces, and then you will cut these 2x4 supports or 2x6 if that's what you're using. These cuts are really easy. All you're doing is cutting them at an angle. Most likely it's going to be anywhere between 10 to 20 degrees. And so you want to get like your back supports like how we have here, and at least this part done. Obviously you're not going to mess around with the coping or anything just yet. This is step 1, is to get the back 2x4 supports all dialed, and so it's spaced evenly. You're next going to have to set up your workstation. Your workstation is going to require a miter saw like this guy, also referred to as a chop saw. You are going to burn through a lot of 2x6s for your supports. You will need definitely a measuring tape and a pencil, because you're going to be making a lot of cuts. What's interesting with bowls is every single 2x4 here, or I'm sorry, 2x6, every single one is cut custom and perfect so it fits in the shape. So this is going to be super time consuming and tedious. That's generally why bowls, the expense for them is pretty high. Not only is it obviously the materials, which now has gone up quite a bit since COVID, but it's just the time. The time that it takes to do one bowl corner, we could be building several mini ramps. So be prepared to have a lot of patience and time. This isn't something that you're going to knock out in a single day. Okay, so we're going to show you how to do a single support. So right now, the very first step, you guessed it, is measure it. So we got to measure it. And then again, this is kind of where trial and error comes into play. The angle is going to be different than what the one above it was. And I'm sure the support below it is going to be different as well. So we're gonna test it out. So for our reference, we'll sometimes write in Sharpie what the angle is that we're messing with. And then yeah, we're just gonna see how this fits. If it fits, great. Most likely it's not. We're gonna need to trim it or adjust it, and you just go back and forth. So we also want to make sure that our supports are in line, all the same. Like this guy is in same with this guy, and so on and so forth. And the reason being is just logically, if you have different how do you say, lines, then when you put on the plywood, you're not going to know how you're going to hit the plywood. And so this just makes it easier having them all be the same. So we needed to trim just a tiny bit. Okay, so this is the next step. So we know it fits. Now this is where you get the curve on the face. So you get the curve on the face. Notice how all these 2x6s, they have that little swoop cut. And so you want to cut it to the shape of your radius. That's how you get that measurement. So not only are you doing your bevel and angle cuts on the miter saw, which could be a nightmare, now you got to cut this guy. So if you notice real quick, we drew the line, and that's the curvature of the radius. So whatever curvature your radius is, whatever that diameter is what you're gonna cut this to. So we're so look at all these that we've had to cut out. These are all the little pieces. So notice how they're all got that tiny little swoop in it. Again, that's the curvature that we're working with. So once again, we're gonna place it back into place and just see if it fits, if everything looks good. So we've got a match, and so we're gonna hold it into place. Perfect. So from start to finish, we're a little under 5 minutes for that one piece. So you could see kind of how tedious it is. If you're just doing one, it's obviously not the end of the world. But the issue is when, I mean, look, you have all these cuts there, all these cuts here to do. So I mean, just this pie here could take you over an hour. And how many little pies do you have to do? So it's just going back and forth, back and forth. So our recommendation is set up your miter saw. Sometimes we've even set up the miter saw like in the center. That way you're not having to travel a bunch, going back and forth and losing time doing that. Now if you notice, we used screws. There's some companies and some builders out there that'll use nails on this step. We do not recommend that. Nails over time, they'll back out. They're not the best for long term. Nails, yeah, they're just garbage. Screws will hold up. They tend to not back up. and you're just gonna get a stronger support. So we were lucky on this one. Only had to cut those bevel and angle cuts once. So now we're gonna cut the face of it at the curve. And you'll notice too, each piece gets smaller, right, as you go down the pie. As you go down the pie, each piece is gonna get smaller and it's gonna be harder to cut. It's a lot easier to cut some of the long ones at the very top of your bowl. You know, doing this guy isn't so bad, but as you get shorter and shorter, it gets trickier as you go. You do want to make sure that you have a powered skill saw. You do not want a battery for this guy because you'll burn up the battery in no time. This blade I think is like 7 1/4 or 7 1/2. And then, yeah, just make sure you have a fresh blade. But in terms of framing, this is the process. So we're gonna spend another few days to do this. And then our next step will be putting in the coping, doing the top decks and plywood. So that'll be next. On the topic of the saw, it is important to note what type of saw that we recommend when you're doing any type of bowl, ramp, cutting for these 2x6 supports. So this is called a dual bevel saw. And if you notice, this guy rotates on either, you could go to the far right or far left. And as simple as that may appear, that's not actually common on all saws. It is kind of like an upgraded feature. Most saws only tilt one direction. You know, they only go to the left and then they could go upright and that's it. So this kind of helps because when you're doing your cuts for those 2x6s right over there, this is where the tedious part gets. And so some basic information on these cuts are, you have these types of cuts we refer to as an angle cut. Some might call it a miter cut. And then the angle on the back is called the bevel. So we're gonna have 2 cuts for every single 2x6 that we do on the ramp. So you'll see that we have to figure out, okay, which angle is the miter angle going to be. Right now we have it set at 6, and then the bevel we have to determine, are we going to be at around 12 degrees or what is it? And then once you have your cut, then you could go over and fit it into place and see how it does. But that's what I'm saying, is that literally every single 2x6, the numbers are going to change. So it's not the same angle and the same bevel for the entire bowl. That's where it gets tricky, and you just have to be patient, play some music, and do a million cuts. So we'll show you how to do a couple cuts next, and we'll see how that goes. Once all the frames are done, then you're going to want to put on the base layer of plywood, and we just finished with this corner. Generally we'll start at the very bottom with a little funky pie shape there, and then you just work your way up. The best way to do it is, you know, step on the sheet of plywood, bend it, and then put a screw in. You could generally what we'll do is we'll mark the lines to match with the radius, and that's what you'll do for the first layer. Your second or third layers, if you do 3 layers, it's not necessary to always land on the radius edge, but we do at least for the first row. Right now you could see that the top isn't fully screwed in just yet, but we'll do that. The other thing to note too is we kind of filled any cracks with caulking. It's not vital that you do that, but it certainly helps just with weathering. So you can kind of see any imperfections we'll fill with the caulking. After this, we're gonna put on a layer of gator skins, and I'll show you that next. This corner here, we finished with the base layer of plywood, and some people put on the coping first. There's no right or wrong way to do it. We're gonna put on the coping pretty soon here, and then we'll cut that top row along there. But again, we start at the bottom with our pie shape. We do pre-drill every hole, and then you'll countersink them, so that way that you can put in the screws just like we have there. And you obviously want to make sure that, especially for your top skating surface, that you use a really good exterior screw, something like a decking screw. What we use is coated, has like a few thousand salt hours of protection. But as we go throughout the day, we're just going to move our way up the bowl and start finishing out all these corners here. We're making progress. One trick that has helped us, it's not a vital trick, but it has been helpful, is your first pie shape. On the underside, we'll score it a little bit, and this just kind of helps it bend into shape. Obviously, you don't want to cut through the material. That defeats the purpose, but you do want to do a fine score with your skill saw. Once you score that piece, then you could place it where it should, and it'll bend a lot better. Again, you want to stand on it and put weight so that it forms into shape before you start putting in your pre-drilled holes and then countersinking it. And obviously you want to be drilling into your supports. You don't want to be just drilling simply into the plywood, because over time with weathering, that'll lift up and it's no good. So make sure that you hit a 2x4 or 2x6 support every time. One of the tricky parts is getting the coping to bend. If you don't have a bender, you might need a professional to help you do it. Obviously not everyone's going to have that machine in their backyard or their garage. Anyways, we got this coping bent. It's perfect. It fits in there flawless. As you can see, we took off that top section of plywood to put in the coping, and then we also put in the supports in the back. So these supports here weren't there before. We popped them in, and then we also screwed into the coping. So this guy is solid. You could see all the screws back there. So this coping isn't going anywhere. The next step is to cut the plywood. We just popped off our first piece and cut it, and we're close, but this just goes to show you not every cut that you do is going to be perfect. So it's kind of, well, it's not kind of, it is a lot of trial and error. So we just need to trim this down a little bit, but it seems like our curvature is pretty accurate. So we're going to do that, and then once we put in these pieces, then we'll go back and finishing off the gator skins here and finish off this corner. Our bowl corners are done. We just finished with putting on the remaining pieces of the gator skin surface. After we started with this main center pie-shaped piece, we actually started with the very middle one here in the center. And so the best thing to do is you find where your center is on the curve, and then same thing at the very bottom. Where's the center? And it literally is just trial and error. So, you know, you kind of cut a flower petal type of shape, put it up there, and it'll overlap the coping, and then you could kind of cut the piece at the top here, the same curvature of the coping afterwards. But it's trial and error. There's no real science behind it, at least right now. And then same thing with the top deck. The top deck we actually cut first out of cardboard, and that's another idea that you could do for the skating surface, is if you have some spare cardboard, you could cut some pieces with that. That way you're not burning through a bunch of plywood and messing up the pieces. And then what we did have to do with the gator skins material is we had to pre-drill and then countersink every single hole. It's not like plywood where you could just drill your screw through it. This you actually have to prepare with a countersinking bit. And like we've mentioned before, we do recommend using an outdoor exterior grade type of decking screw. You don't want to use just a generic screw. That stuff has a few thousand salt hours, so it'll last a very long time. The next step after this is we're going to install it into place into a whole mini ramp setup and connect all the corners, and we will be done.